Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 6th of May 2018. Quite the times we live in, quite the times. I was talking to someone this week on the incredible amount of management we have over us. The general public have no idea at all what's going on with the multi-layered strata, really, of specialized departments and really forms of bureaucracies that are added on, tacked on. And a lot of them don't get elected, of course. They're, as you well know, they're actually farmed out to private organizations by government, to managers. This is the new form of governance, as they call it. And we're really well into it, well into it. But the public, again, are kept running and when they're not running and working, they're playing. And when they're playing, they're being indoctrinated. And when they're playing, they want to get zonked out too. They don't want you to think about all the nasty stuff that's going on in the world, because it's too much, the way it's presented to them, especially because it's all perception management. You're given the perceptions you're supposed to have and how you're supposed to think about things and how you're supposed to see things. It's quite the system we live in. Quite the system. But when you look at it all, it makes a lot of sense the way they do it on behalf of the controllers and owners. We're owned. We truly are owned. When you see the arrogance, that incredible arrogance that has come out of universities with the new courses and managing us all, from the eco this and eco that and sustainability this and sustainability that, it's just phenomenal, isn't it? They've all got to get jobs. And they get jobs through massive grants to the private organizations that manages. But as I say, people have been weaned out of democracy but still under the illusion that they have it, because they're allowed to vote every 4 or 5 years. But in reality, it's your governance. The governance system is not democratic. It's not intended to be democratic. It's intended to have the appearance of democracy. The old Soviet system, remember, Soviet system meant rule by council. And these councils were appointed by the people at the top of the Soviet system, naturally. But they had the appearance of almost voluntary panels, you might say, for unions or for different strata, again, of working class peoples, or workers, put it that way. This nonsense about it was for the workers is a good con indeed, the Soviet system, because it wasn't. But nothing ever is. Nothing really ever is. Power and technique of governing billions of people across the world has never been lost. And this has been here for an awful long time with this system we call civilization. And by that I really just mean that we have records of writing at the very least, because writing seems to have come in not to entertain yourselves and read good novels in ancient days, to chipping away in the cave there on your stone tablets. And no, nothing to do with that at all. It was to do, if you look at Sumer, for instance, about record keeping, monetary record keeping especially, law, the transference of property, the dividing of property, land property, and so on. Incredible system, so incredibly old. But along with it came governance. How do you govern the people? And naturally, those who had the education and those who had the time to study how to con people, basically, how to manage the people. And it's an art in itself, a big art. Machiavelli wasn't the first person to come along with techniques of being awfully devious. I think from the beginning of time, this whole idea of governance has always been there. It's always been there. And so what you get, really, is a system where school is taught to the few. And school comes from the Greek word, the old Greek term, for leisure. Because only those with leisure could learn anything. The rest of people were toiling away or slaving away, literally slaving away at times. But the people who would end up governing the people and managing big businesses, the old corporations of their day, the big corporations, to do with trade and so on, they were taught how to manage the general public. In a sense, too, that's what also philosophy, old ancient philosophy, was all about. Maybe even not so much ancient either, by the way. It's a substitute, especially in a post-Christian era today, of how to manage people, how people tick, what life's about, according always from a ruling class's point of view, and how to manage the people. And Plato was more open about it because he wrote about it in the Republic, basically. He put into it the questions that he and his own particular class at the time had been asking and throwing around amongst each other about governing the people and how to do it and so on. What do people want? How do you keep them happy? How do you even mislead them? And also, along with it comes the arrogance of trying to find a reason for being so arrogant. Which is, of course, and this is the thing with Plato, he said, is it possible that we, the governors, basically, have lived before, since we can understand the geometry very quickly, we pick it up very quickly, mathematics and so on, but these other people can't. So they rationalize it. Well, that's because we're superior in that case. Anything that makes you feel superior is a good technique for being really rotten to everybody else. That's never changed. Never changed. But today, getting back to today, in an atheistic system of secular humanism and the humanistic philosophies, and along with it comes eugenics and everything else. You don't have the barriers which kept you from implementing real in-depth eugenics. They're gone now. They've gone completely. The moral barriers are gone. Because now the general population are pretty well the same. They're atheistic. They've been brought up and raised by television, where they get so much of their opinions from. And opinions, remember, to have a fully informed opinion, you'd have to have access to every possible piece of information on the subject. And you'd have to have an honest presentation, which I've never heard an honest presentation in my life on anything. Because presentations are generally slanted in such a way by omission of other. It's like drugs, for instance, for medications. Such a massive scam goes on about, and I've done the articles before years ago, from the mainstream newspapers, from people who didn't give their names out, but they wrote a lot of the write-ups for, and they claimed they did all the testing for a particular drug or whatever, and they fudged it all for big money. And this is a common practice, of course. So you never get an honest presentation on anything, especially when it comes from your own government. It won't happen. There's always see, the agendas in government are always preset before the public even hear what they're on about. The agendas are set pretty well in stone. How do we get from the massive herd from this sitting in this field to that field over yonder? And then they work, and this is old technique, mind you. They work in tandem with other governments because they're all run by the same system. There's only one system here to do with, again, with the big banking powers. And underneath the banking comes, again, the leisure class that can do all the professions, and they can work away at all the professions through good education. They already have the universities sewn up to make sure that their own selected people will get in to them. And that's why you have varieties of various clubs, you might call them, which select who gets into the universities and the high levels and who doesn't. And who gets scholarships today, too, especially in the US. It's very open about how it's run. You've had all the clues in your lifetime, although it's probably gone over your heads. You're taught that anything that invalidates this whole idea of we're just stumbling along day by day and people just come along, get elected, and start fixing things and working things out for you. If you come up with a different version of that, because again, you've got to have access to all the information on any particular topic, right? Then only then can you come to a really informed conclusion. Everything is slanted, though. Some countries are so open about. When I was a child, I used to, because my dad was into electronics, as a hobby, not very good at it, because he really didn't have the, he just didn't have the basic. He sent off for these kits for making radios, and something would always go wrong when he's reading the diagrams and so on. But occasionally I would pick up an old one they'd been working on and got it going, and you could pick up shortwave, which was terrific at that time. But I listened to the BBC as well, on the radio, and there's a very obvious technique and format which BBC used. But it was like a system dictating to the public, the Bureau of blah, 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 and the Department of blah, blah, blah has decided that blah, 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 and the Ministry of Agriculture has decided that blah, blah, blah. It was like diktats to the public. But what got me was, as time went on, the Soviets, the Radio Moscow, began to sound exactly like the BBC. The Supremes, blah, 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 of the people has decided, blah, blah, blah. And the same thing, departments of. And that format is even in China now. It's across the whole planet. And of course, you could definitely see it with CBC Canada and Radio Australia and so on. Because, see, all information must be standardized. And that's how it's going to form the opinions that your masters want you to have. But so you must all get the same information. No more, just the same information at the same time on the same topics to make sure you all have the same standardized opinion. And it works awfully well. When you've aimed at world domination a long time ago, and there's definitely a group, by the way, it's been here for an awful long time, with different strata of deceptions across the world, with the money ones at the top, since everything must run on this money system. And this money system must go and work in hand with the World Bank in this day and age, and the Bank for International Settlements that Carol Quigley talked about. They'd be the arbiters across the whole planet for currency and the value of each nation's currency. But it also means you must have central banks to draw from, which are all privately owned too by the same people across the whole planet. And because everything runs on this money system, and this money decides if you live, die, or you get a good education, or you don't, or you get an incredibly good income, even if you're pretty dumb, with a good education, and lots of folk are. Therefore, most folk want to get more money, and they'll do anything to get it. And that's where you come into this class idea. And it is true, I've listened to different classes, and I've got an ability to stand out of things and just observe and remember. And it's fascinating to me, always fascinating, to hear the different opinions for different classes that they'll parrot. Guaranteed they'll parrot too. It's quite fascinating to see how it works and what those opinions are going to be on different topics. This is just me doing that. But then I read all the studies that the big boys do all the time on all of us. They've got all the universities in this day and age completely involved, using our tax money, of course, to give them grants to study everything to do with humans, everything. Sexual habits, all kinds of things, likes, dislikes, even passing fads that you're given from the top. What do you think about this passing fad? And they come out with the percentages and all the rest of it and so on. And that's what George Orwell had, of course, in 1984 with the percentage game too. Every government in the world has this percentage departments now, which is meant to make you bend one way or another. Well, most folk have decided, and 60% decided blah, blah, blah. Oh, therefore they won in a sense, so do you want to be on board with the winners? That is so simple a technique, but it actually works. Because humans are not quite logical, like Bertrand Russell said. He knew this. And he was one of the planners for the masters at the top. So getting back to what I'm saying, in the system, pretty well everybody wants to get up on the top, as much money as they can. And because of that, those who rule the money are guaranteed to keep the same system going with them in the top, even though as they change it for all those down below as it goes along. The origin, for instance, of Freemasonry, regardless of the rubbish they give you, is very old. And there's no doubt about it that in the Middle Ages, we were given lots and lots of data about this organization. The organization, again, was based on wealth and power at the top. It also had to bring in people from different strata of the classes in society to make it work more harmoniously without too many rebellions on different levels. So they gave you organizations, Rosicrucianism, for instance. And when they created the bigger system of Freemasonry from Rosicrucian, they adopted a degree into it of the Rosicrucian system. But you can definitely find it in the 1500s and 1600s. And the US basically took, not by accident by the way, but it took the same agenda of the New Atlantis before it became the United States of America. And if you understand that, you'll understand the money system, the money people. You'll understand how it was to take over the world system and manage the whole world system of money, bring it all under its control. But the bulk of the population were always to be kept in the dark. They were to be given a plausible but fake reality for themselves to believe in as to what their system was, but a secret elite would manage the system. And that's how things really are. And that's how they've always been since then. The old idea about John Dee, for instance, he brought too much disrepute upon himself and the clique that he was in with by what he did with the calling down of different spirits and so on. And he used Kabbalah. It was too well open and into the calling up of the dead and so on. It did not go well in a time when there's a Christian church on the go. Francis Bacon picked it up, still used Kabbalah, and he tried to camouflage a little bit, make it more palatable and intriguing, of course. A good story is always intriguing. And they came out with a more acceptable version, put it that way, for the people who become members of it down the road, right to this present day. And in London, of course, they already had the group in there. And they created the City of London, which is the banking centre. And it became the banking centre for the whole planet at one point. After the World War, after it was getting used, they moved the centre of power, especially the gopher side of it, the army side of it, because weaponry gets more and more expensive. Britain had its sponge wrung out by 2 world wars. But they moved it to the US. And I think it was always meant to be that way. The US was set up to take over. And the US only has a few things to do today. Before it'll be wrung out too, and it must submerge into the world system that it forced upon everybody else. And it did force it. The US has never had peace, really, for any length of time. Even in peacetime, they've had many covert wars on the go. And most folk today are trained. We're trained that it's normal. There are people today who were born into the first big attack on the Middle East, after World War II, that is. The first big attack was Saddam Hussein going into Kuwait. And the reasons were quite clear at the time. It was articles in major magazines about it before it all happened, because he looked for permission to go in and stop the Kuwaitis from doing parallel drilling under the ground into Iraqi territory. That's what happened. I think, and some of the science magazines had diagrams and so on showing you how it was done. And he thought he'd get permission to go in and stop it all, and he did go in. And then they turned on him, of course, because Kuwait really was set up. The oil fields in Kuwait were set up by the Bush family, for those who didn't know that. That was one of the first projects of the father, who also was the head of the CIA at one point. See, you're dealing with strategies where most folk will think, here's the goal. We're short-term thinkers and very close view, you might say, projects. We can't understand things there. We'll do this first, which will lead to this, which will lead to that, which will lead to this. That's exactly how the world is run. Therefore, Saddam Hussein had to be taken out, and this went on for years. Now, there are people born about 1991, and all they've ever known is war against different places in the Middle East, which, again, revamped even further. Don't forget, it had even stopped from about 91 onwards, but it got revamped more so with 9/11 happening, the Pearl Harbor event that the Peanut Group talked about, that they would need to happen, and they got it. And you find that literally pretty well a generation has grown up thinking it's all quite normal. They think it's quite normal, especially since 9/11, that everything is monitored, everything they do is monitored, everything they say is monitored, everything they email, write, or whatever is all monitored and kept. I think it's all quite normal because they've grown up in it. And that's how easy it is. That's how easy it is to take rights away from the people. It's just too easy, isn't it? So incredibly easy. And they've always known this too, that people will do with less to eat, for instance, during wartime, like World War II, or I for that matter. They did have rationing to an extent in World War I in Britain. Then they went straight into Great Depression. And then they went straight into World War II. And it wasn't until the 1950s that they got them off the ration cards. You're a malnourished generation there. And I remember reading on the air at the time an article from the Green Party leader in Britain who said, if only we can have something like the Blitz in Britain, where they'd obey government and they'd do with less and become like austerity, stop preaching austerity, and do with not expecting as much financially, with less money, less buying power for things, and just do what they were told. Obey, obey, obey. She thought this was great. If only I could bring it back in. She's not unique. I hope folk never think, they never fall for the TV version of the decent people. I hope they don't. There's a duality pretty well on everybody. We all have the choices, don't we? And most folk will always take the choice that benefits them directly first and foremost, regardless of the expense of other people. And talking about so many different deceptions, all working together in strata, with a whole long-term agenda to fulfill. And wars galore, always around the same area, you'll notice. Why is that? Unraveling what happens in the world is a simple detective story. And you have to find who the players are. What do they have in common? That's what detectives do on anything. That's what governments do all the time. If they find there are people who are upset about things and sending in petitions and this and that and the other, what do they all have in common? What ethnic group are they from? What religious group are they from? What this, what that, what gender, blah, 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 blah. That's what they do. So why are you always over there in the Middle East? Money, a money system worldwide, a system talked about in the Middle Ages, a system that could create Freemasonry to bring a larger group in to help with it all, who will personally profit from it one way or another. They get privileges. And depending on the rank within Masonry, and it's a rank system, you would get more privileges if you're higher up the rank, obviously. And yet, it's forbidden for this group to discuss themselves, what their so-called secrets are, to the general public. And you accept that, don't you? And everybody's got people and friends who have been or are Masons, or relatives, pretty well. And their generations, you're going to find somebody. And some were working class people, mainly from World War I onwards. That's when they started bringing the working class in more so. Before that, it was strictly a pretty well professional type system. People who would govern the people. But you still need a bigger percentage of them, especially when you have so many wars to fight and planned, you see. And that's where you are today. 20 years ago, the group that took over America, who were very vocal about their intentions, a group that could take a whole nation and all its taxpayers and put them to war. It's a very powerful group indeed. And they knew they'd only have one run at it, at one go. And they knew too that they'd have to come back in again. This is before they started it all. They knew how long they'd last, pretty accurately. They didn't get it all done the first time. They had a whole list drafted up, and that's common knowledge what the list is. And the General Clark talked about it too. And I remember at the time, all that time ago, the countries they wanted to take out. And Saddam Hussein really had nothing to do with 9/11, remember? And they'd made that later. But it didn't matter. It was someone else's agenda. It wasn't what the people thought it was. And another country, wanted them to go all the way, all through all the rest of the countries, including Libya, and into Syria, and finish them off as well. Rather adamant about it. And we're still going through it again. Today. They knew they'd have to bring in someone else again, almost covertly, to get the public to back it. Because they would never vote in the PNAC group again. A group that can change its names when they want to, and they did, of course. But what a power to use nations, and their armies, and their finances, and their complete military setup, to advance a goal that the public are basically ignorant of. And how they can take 20 years to build up, or actually to take over a whole movement of people. I can remember the Patriot movement in the US. There were all kinds of stations which filled in all the different blanks to do with what the ordinary people thought America was about. And it was, at one point, a kind of beacon on rights to the rest of the world. Regardless of, by that time, the governments didn't follow it, the laws and so on. But at least the people knew, and they would stand up and complain together and demand, which is an awful nuisance to governments. You don't get so much of it today, you notice. Again, because you're under a form of warfare type scenario, just like the Green Party member in Britain said. You'll put up with more and accept it. But that group way back then, with 9/11, knew their time would be short. And they had a second plan to get someone else in way down the road, under a guise, a deception guise. And how do you get a big backing? Well, you take over the natural movement of the people that really was across the whole country, of people with their rights and so on. Copy it. What you do is make a copy of it. That's what you do. And then you start, after a while, start bending it a bit more, until you can take them in 180 degrees, all the followers, till they've actually changed positions of where they all were before without even knowing it. It's so slick. And they're used as a massive voting bloc. Not that the people had any chance of a decent vote in the first place with what's presented to them, like last time, by different parties. Because there's only one system. And as Quigley said, speaking on behalf of the CFR, and the Royal Institute for International Affairs, he said himself that the leaders, and a few around the leaders, are allowed competition of parties, but the agendas must be the same. They all belong to the same organization. They all know it. Communism, for instance, was had many front groups with wonderful sounding names and national sounding names like Federalists and, etc. Stacks and stacks of them. CFR is another front organization, not run by the communists, but run by the folk who ran the communists as well. Because one group run all sides. And I've gone through the histories of how fascinated they were with all the different systems they were trying out at the time. They were fascinated by the communist system. They studied it because it showed you how to manage millions of people and how to overcome difficulties in managing millions of people and making them really obedient and sacrificing for a belief. That's all incredibly well studied. And they also studied the Nazi system. another socialist system. Don't forget the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was a Soviet system, and the National Socialist Movement of Germany. Don't forget it. And what you're in today, under this wonderful sounding, well, the word social, it means you're friendly, doesn't it? Social. I'm a social person. I like mix. I'm gregarious. Are you? Does that mean you've got to be gregarious to be social? Think about it. But it's hard to fight against, isn't it? Terminology is awfully important for brainwashing and deceiving the people.